thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the invitation. A few preliminary remarks. These views are not in any way an official view. They are my personal views. It is an evolving area. As some of you may know, there has been a project going on for some years now, sponsored by the Battlefields Trust, the main charity for preserving and better researching and better presenting battlefields in England, to try and locate the precise site, supported by heritage lottery money, and it is a changing situation. We've heard the broad background. Let's start with a quick look back, and we'll start with a quotation from the time. With Jackson Sallets clean, misrule doth prosper, the weak goes under as oft 'tis seen. We've heard about all the joys of border banditry that has been going on for at least 100 years. To my surprise, we've not had reference to Pyleth Bryn-Glas, when the Mortimers got taken to bits in West Wales at the beginning of the century, but I think it forms part of the cultural overlay. But we do see the cohesive nature of the traditional Mortimer allies, and never forget that on his maternal line, Edward IV is very much a Mortimer, very much a marcher, and has been brought up there, and he's fighting alongside men he has known all his life. Let's recap briefly on the Wars of the Roses. Personally, I take a longer view. I think it starts as the Wars of Succession to Richard II, and therefore goes back to the beginning of the century. You can take your pick on that. We see England and Wales descending into disorder. In a nutshell, it starts out as a battle for power under King Henry VI, with on the one hand the Lancastrian faction led by Margaret of Anjou, his queen, and on the other the Duke of York, the premier Duke of the land, and with arguably a stronger claim to the throne than the king himself. Things have been building up. It culminates in Ludford, the Battle of Ludford Bridge, which isn't a battle, because as we heard earlier, the Yorkist element is effectively cornered at Ludlow. The professional garrison of Calais, who are no fools, eye up the odds and decide which horse is going to win and change their bets accordingly. The Yorkist household withdraw to the castle for a planning conference, you understand, chaps, and the next scene on the fast getaway horse heading to Ireland and Calais. Quite what the effect on morale of that will have been after they come back, I leave you to judge for yourselves. Put yourself in the position of a Croft or a Vaughan who's been deserted on the field of battle. But it is still homogeneous. So, the Yorkists return with the financial support of the City of London and the backing of the Burgundians, who have ulterior motives, and we often forget the international element of the Wars of the Roses. They confront Henry VI at Northampton. They capture him, they capture his artillery train, and it is beyond dispute that artillery, in the sense of cannon, are deployed at the Battle of Northampton, probably on both sides, and certainly that the Yorkists have captured them. The Yorkists move to London. The Duke of York ups the stakes by claiming the throne, as opposed to the old excuse protecting the king from an evil advisor, which you can certainly find as long ago as the Barons' Wars a few centuries before, and you'll find as the standard cry of Parliament in the English Civil War. Richard, Duke of York, tries it on with a claim for the throne, doesn't get the support he is expecting, falls out with his cousin Warwick the Kingmaker, and this has to be mediated by his young son, Edward IV. I call him young, he's about 18. Gives you some idea of the impressive nature of the future King Edward IV. The Yorkists take a militarily sensible viewpoint. They put one force out under Edward IV, as he is to later become Edward, Earl of March, into their traditional heartlands to secure and protect them and act as a flank guard, to use modern military terminology, against any force coming in from the Tudor interest in West Wales. Let us not forget that the Tudors are half-brothers of the king. A force is left in reserve, always a good military principle, covering London, and possession of London and its revenue and support is crucial to success throughout the Wars of the Roses, with a force there under the Earl of Warwick screening it, whilst the Duke of York himself marches northwards to confront the remaining Lancastrians until he gets basically ambushed and bushwhacked at Sandal Castle, near Wakefield, and is overpowered and killed. Henry VI still remains under Yorkist control. So if, in military terms, we're doing a sitrep, as at Situation Report, as at the 1st of January 1461, what does it look like? The Lancastrians have got a victorious army in the north, moving south from their victory in Yorkshire, not entirely pleasing the locals off whom they live as they pass. Secondly, there's a Lancastrian mixed force under the Tudors, together with James Butler, accurately described as the flashman of his day, in Pembrokeshire. Their force is mixed. It's polyglot, Irish, Welsh, Breton, French, Burgundian, perhaps, and English. This leads to all sorts of practical problems of command and control, quite apart from cohesion, mutual understanding, and mutual trust. Look at the situation from the Tudors and Earl of Wiltshire's point of view. They missed out at Ludford Bridge. They didn't get there in time. They look as though they're on the winning side at this point. Margaret is marching south. If they want to participate in the rewards of the defeat of the Yorkists, then they need to be playing an important part. They need to be seen to be fighting the cause. Let's look at it from the Yorkist point of view. The main striking force has been destroyed. The Yorkist, the head of the Nevilles, the key Yorkist allies, has been killed. The Earl of Salisbury is dead. The Duke of York is killed. Edmund of Rutland is killed. He's not a child, as Shakespeare maintains. He's 16, which is perfectly adequate for military service by the standards of the time. It means that there's only one Yorkist, in the sense of a son of the House of York, alive and credible as a claimant to the throne at this point, and that is Edward, Earl of March. I know Shakespeare makes great play in his, not to coin a pun, Shakespeare makes great play about the conversation with Richard III, future Richard III, at Mortimer's Cross, between him and his brother Edward. This is pretty improbable, given that Richard was only about 8 at the time. Shakespeare may be great drama, but he's often pretty rotten history, and he is writing 150 years or so after the event. To put that into context, that is about as accurate as a modern play about the Boer War is in terms of being contemporary. Warwick still has the reserve screening London. In fact, the wheels come off him at the Battle of St Albans, but it is often forgotten that he's able to extricate himself from St Albans and his army doesn't entirely rout. Lastly, we have the key focus. We have Edward, Earl of March in the Welsh marches with the traditional Mortimer retinue and allies. Now, I know that we have got some people with us today from overseas, so I will just give you a little bit of background just to highlight that. So assuming I can get my pen to work. There we go. Laser pointer. Mortimer's Cross is down here on the borders of England and Wales, the Marcher territories. The Lancastrian power in the north is marching south towards London, possession of which is key, and just outside is at St Albans is Warwick covering that. Coming in from the west is the Tudor Wiltshire force from Pembrokeshire around here, coming across, and they need to link up with Margaret somewhere. How are they going to move? They have a number of strategic routes. They can come along the coast. They can come up across country in some way, but we know that it is winter. Horses need a lot of feed. Where are you going to find enough feed? How much feed you need? We don't know that because we don't know how many horses are there. We do know that water is desperately important to horses on the move, which means that the river network is important because it provides drinking water for horses who don't half shift it and who become ineffective very quickly if they're not watered. So there is the map of the area in detail taken from Hodges' book, and there is Mortimer's Cross on the river line. Strategically, do the Lancastrians approach this way with the old Roman road going up and down that way? Do they come in by one or two of the different routes that come in across Wales? There's no evidence either way on that, but it does reflect the direction of approach. But we do know that the Yorkists are the home side. Facing this polyglot approaching force, they are contained and unified, and they have the choice of ground which they know well. You have heard already about how they have lots of allies in South Wales, so they're going to be able to pick up early information about the Lancastrian moves. They will have the advantage of tactical, the Yorkists, will have the advantage of tactical surprise. It is often said that battles are fought, modern battles are invariably fought on the corner of four maps, a practical application of Murphy's law to military matters. In medieval warfare, when you're trying to trace anything back, it is tracing where parish boundaries are. That is important because it's through the parish records that you can reconstruct the landscape. As you can see from this map, produced by Tracy PADRE as part of the Mortimer's Cross project, you'll see that the modern village of Mortimer's Cross sits smack on the boundaries of four parishes. Look at the ground generally. To the south, you have fairly open countryside. It is now barely a footpath, but the old road from Aberystwyth, the Packhorse road comes in this way across to Kingsland. You have the old Roman road running north-south, up that way. This road doesn't exist as a main road at the time. That's a toll road that comes later. This road from Shobden that cuts straight here, that cuts straight down, doesn't exist. It may have been a track, but it's not a through road. Particularly the cutting in that steep valley there doesn't exist. And as it approaches this area around Mortimer's Cross, while you've got the open area to the south, you have got wooded hillside up here. The lug goes up and does an L shape, forming effectively a Y of river valleys like that. Croft Castle, by the way, is just up here. So that's the ground. Open terrain to the south. defiles and woodland to the north, and the Yorkists have got a choice of ground and the strategic initiative of knowing which way the Lancastrians are coming. The Lancastrians are unlikely to have had that detailed a knowledge of the Yorkist position. Traditionally, we have viewed there have been a number of leading theories about where the battlefield where the battle was fought. On the map on the left is the one that you'll find on the Battlefields Trust website. There are two sites. The older site, which envisages fighting in this area, this green footpath being the old packhorse route to Kingsland, which was a long established village township, with the idea being the Yorkists took up in open countryside a blocking position against the approaching Lancastrians. This was clearly the view shared in the 19th century because they put up the memorial, which we'll talk about in a moment, just there. The more recent sources tend to favour an action somewhere up here, just south of the modern Mortimer's Cross. As I said, Croft Castle up here, Wigmore a few miles, Amesbury, and beyond that, Wigmore a few miles up there, just short of that high ground. This is the deployment suggested by Croft. This Hereford Lane is the old Roman road. The A4110 doesn't exist. At least if it is, it's no more than a cart track. And that doesn't exist, or it's little more than a cart track. We don't know what crossing there was possible across the river there. Of course, I've talked about roads, but at this point, there's also a conceptual problem. Can I take you back with me slightly less far than to 1460, but to 1980? In 1980, I was a young reservist intelligence officer, and I was taught very firmly that when a Russian, our likely opponents, talked about Doroga, a road, he meant somewhere he could get his forces along. As far as he was concerned, an open forest ride was very much a road as the M1 might be. And that is often a conceptual problem which is difficult when reconstructing battlefields, because we don't think of the layout necessarily in the same way that a contemporary of the battle would have done. A variant of the northern battlefield is one that we sometimes see presented on the right. There you've got the modern Mortimer's Cross pub, and he comes up with, the author of this map comes up with a quite detailed map of it. It's taken from Peter Bramley's book, A Companion and Guide to the Wars of the Roses, which is an excellent book generally, except it is very short on the sources. And so far as I can establish, there are absolutely no sources that corroborate this account. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen that way. It means that it isn't corroborated from the sources. So how do we find a battlefield? Remember Bosworth. With the ages, we thought it was up near the modern centre. Various other sites were proposed, and a project was undertaken. It took 5 years to find the correct site of Bosworth. Even then, they nearly missed it. Even now, there is some dispute between commentators as to the tactical dispositions of exactly who was where and in what formation. But how do we set about finding a battlefield? Well, first, you go back to your primary sources. You also look at secondary sources if they may have had access to primary sources that are now lost. And you interrogate and approach them to try and see what they're really telling us. Bear in mind that all sources are invariably biased in some way, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. sometimes giving away rather more than the writer intended. There's a problem with secondary sources because an odd concept can be repeated again and again and pick up a truth of its own. That happened at Northampton at one point, although the earlier Victorian versions can now be comprehensively debunked by reference to the topography and the archaeology. Topography. It's not a question of what the land looks like now, but trying to peel back the real estate to how it was. That's a key element that the project has been working on, with some success, but we are by no means finished. Do not forget the wise words of the Duke of Wellington when he saw with horror the monument being erected on the battlefield of Waterloo, that is now the Butte de Lyon, and all the excavation work to get the earth to build it. He said that they were ruining his battlefield. How far has the area around Mortimer's Cross changed? How do we peel it back to what it was, particularly when the land records are poor and the area is on the junction of about at least four parishes? Next, you look at the archaeology. First, what archaeology is there? Secondly, applying sources and topography and what we know about what armies fought and work and did their stuff. Where do we think we ought to look to see if we can find anything more? Then we put it all together, but it does take an awful lot of time and luck. We are not all as fortunate as the Ricardians, whose excavation to find the body of King Richard struck pay dirt on the first, or effectively the first trench. I said Bosworth took 5 years. Before we move on, we're going to talk about parhelions. The picture I've used to illustrate it was taken by Peter Burley a few years ago, at pretty much the right time of year. He took his at the end of December, and that shows a not very good parhelion, but you can see the refraction, and you've got more than one sun. And I'm glad to tell you that that is indeed a 1461 Wars of the Roses battlefield. Actually, it's the battlefield of Second St. Albans. Now let's assume in 200 years, you're trying to research what we knew in the 21st century, and you came across that picture, and you knew it was a parhelion, and you knew it was a 1461 Wars of the Roses battlefield. You would immediately jump to the conclusion it was Mortimer's Cross, but you'd be wrong. And that is why such care is needed in dealing with the sources. So what does a parhelion look like? Because it's one of the few known features of the battlefield. There we have it. It's a sun which has been refracted by ice crystals so as to give a mirage effect that there are in fact 3 suns. That it appeared at or around the time of the battle is clear. Edward adopted it as his badge. He used it for political propaganda purposes as a sign of divine favour, and nobody contemporary contradicted him. Therefore, we can be reasonably certain that that has been confirmed by other sources, fits with our understanding, and is likely to be true. So let's go back to the sources. And if you go back to the sources, where do you start? Well, the obvious place is you look at the chronicles. But these are not necessarily written by eyewitnesses. There are not many chronicle entries for the Battle of Mortimer's Cross. The Battlefields Trust have been able to locate about 6. Several of those record the battle as being near to Wigmore. 3 talk about it as being in Wales, when in fact this is in Herefordshire. 4 talk about it as being at Mortimer's Cross, but not specifying any further than that. and one is in a completely different area, saying that it is somewhere between Ludlow and Little Hereford, which is somewhere else altogether. It's about 10 miles away. They are very short on tactical detail, like they give none at all. So much for the written sources. Who wrote them? Clerks, largely, priests, and occasionally townsmen. If you were trying to write an account of the recent, let's say, the war in Afghanistan, who would you want to talk to and whose reminiscences would you find most useful? That of the generals, the brigadiers, the war diaries, the evidence of the war diaries, or would you go and ask the PADRE? I think I know which I prefer out of those two for an accurate account of what happened. But we are forced to ask the PADRE, or where the merchants are concerned, we're required to go and ask not so much the competent supply chain, but those supplying the suppliers well back. One of the best sources, contemporary sources, I think, is the picture. This is copyright to the British Library. It's part of the famous Harley manuscript. It is clear political propaganda in which the victorious Edward is asking for divine guidance. We've got the 3 stars betokening divine intervention, the 3 crowns for the Yorkist heirs, and you've got God speaking down through the clouds, through the PARHELION, giving blessing. Clear propaganda. Incidentally, again, careful with sources, Edward appearing to wear black armour? No. In fact, he's the key figure, so he is painted in silver. Silver tarnishes over time, and in 400 years, the silver has tarnished to black. So it's not evidence he wears black armour. But what is interesting is the background. Notice a ridge with a castle on it or behind it brought forward for illustrative purposes. A gap or ravine of some form. Possible, I don't know what that is, but a possible further castle here. Because if that represents Croft Castle up round here, and that is Wigmore brought out of dead ground onto the top of the hill for illustrative purposes, and that is the narrow ravine that leads to Amesbury, then this picture would be putting the site of the battle near the northern sites. It is interesting that if you carry out a similar exercise to the other panel in the same, one of the other panels in the same manuscript, and apply that to Northampton, you get a fix on where we now think the battlefield is that is accurate and does not fit with the Victorian sources. I need to speed up. Topography. We know it's an ancient landscape with pre-Roman, Bronze Age settlements, if not earlier. I've told you about the Roman roads running north-south, and the other roads vary. Open area to the south, hills and defiles to the north. The project is doing a lot of work on the usage, and we know that it's a mix of great open fields, many of them lost, woodland, open common, meadows by the river, and small enclosures. Where the boundaries were, we do not yet know, but are working on it. What is clear, or what seems to be emerging, is that the Great West Field, which is often associated with the battlefield, isn't just around Kingsland. It may stretch a lot further north, towards the crossroads at Mortimer's Cross. Let's move on. The archaeology, which I suppose includes not just archaeology, but everything's on there that's on the battlefield. On the left, that's a shot taken on the northern battlefield area, That is called Blue Mantle Cottage. And the legend runs that Blue Mantle is the name of one of the heralds, and it is indeed one of the heraldic offices. That Blue Mantle was involved in negotiations or parleys before battle and was treacherously slain. Slight problem with this, if you ask the College of Heralds, they've got no record of a Blue Mantle poursuivant going missing at around this time. And they suggest that that may have been a pub, as this is where the Roman road, the minor road here, joins the modern road on the northern side. That is not impossible, particularly as the modern Mortimer's Cross Inn is just out of sight up there. It also had battle oak in its in the grounds, which fell recently. It is said that a sword was found there, but nobody's ever found the sword since. Disappearing archaeology. A monument erected in the 18th century just outside Kingsland. I showed you where that was earlier. That shows you where earlier generations thought it was, and they had found something, it would seem, from the reports that was what was found when they dug or built the toll road. But the artifacts have disappeared, so we can't analyze what they found, and they didn't record accurately where they found it. Kingsland Church would have been there at the time, has an ancient sanctuary cross. Nearby it is the old castle of Kingsland, which was in disrepair even then. And what I'm told is Soldier's Brook. It is said that this is very good for washing your wounds in and was used for that after the battle. There's a problem always with local traditions, of course. I remember as a young lad being told by the eminent archaeologist who excavated Cadbury Castle, when asked a question at a public presentation, whether it was Camelot. Well, he said, the problem is this. How do you get local tradition? You go and ask the oldest villager on site. Now, the oldest villager is not necessarily the dimmest. And if it is worth an evening's free drink in the Red Lion, for that Iron Age fort to be known as Camelot since his youth, guess what he's going to tell the archaeologist, and suffering from memory loss each time his glass runs a bit low. All sources are biased, remember. But we haven't actually found anything in our targeted searches, which have not been going that long and which have been disrupted by the COVID pandemic, by other environmental local issues about some land going up for sale, and you've got no right to barge in, you've got to get farmers' consent and all that. But what are we looking for? We are in a transitional age of warfare. Yes, the arrow, the archery and the arrow had been a major weapon, but it was coming towards its eclipse at the hands of gunpowder weapons. The English defeat at Castillon, ending the 100 Years' War in 1455, sorry, can't remember the exact day of Castillon, but it's just before the Wars of the Roses, had been affected by the French using cannon in a fortified position. That is a cannonball found at Northampton the year before Mortimer's Cross and examined with care forensically. So what are we actually looking for? Are we looking for arrowheads? Are we looking for shot? Shot can be stone, or like this one, it can be stone with a metal center. What firearms were present? We just don't know. Going back to Bramley, he says there were no firearms there, no artillery. He may be right, but he doesn't give any source for that. We do know that the Yorkists in 1460 had pretty much scooped the pool post at Northampton for artillery, but we don't know where they sent them or whether they were available. Artillery at the time needing skilled artisans to operate it. So we don't really know what we're looking for. Absence of evidence or evidence of absence. That is one of the key debates. If you don't find something, there are a number of possibilities. Firstly, you may have been looking in the wrong place. And bear in mind that if you take a force of, shall we say, a few thousand, divide it down into 3 battles, that gives you about 600, 750 people per battle. If you then subdivide that into 4 ranks, you have a limited frontage, put them in 8 ranks and even fewer. So you may only be dealing with a frontage of a few hundred yards. And the work that is yet to be done is to take what we know about the reconstructed landscape and apply what we know about the forces available and the options available to the Yorkists to try and work out whether we've been looking in the right place. Because first of all, you may have been looking in the wrong place. Secondly, you might have been looking in the right place, but the needle in the haystack evaded you. The earth may have moved or degraded the artifact that was there. It may have been taken in antiquity, or worse still, in modern times and not recorded. And that leads me on to the 3 pictures here. On the left is the tombs of Sir Richard Croft in Croft Castle. Prime source, it shows you what armour he wanted to be remembered as wearing in later life. But this is an example of something that's moved, even though he died and was buried at Croft Castle. Croft Castle itself was destroyed in the English Civil War, and that tomb is not in its original position. We haven't lost that piece of evidence, but it has moved. The Mortimer's Cross Sallet, the Hereford Sallet in the Hereford Museum. Yes, that is a helmet of the appropriate, that would have been appropriate for military use at the time. Does it have anything to do with the battle? We just don't know. It was found 12 miles downstream. That may be consistent with being lost in the route. It may be consistent with just having been dropped. One helmet does not a battlefield make. And lastly, on my right, on the right of the screen, you have a picture of a metal framed door, or a door with metal reinforcing plates on it. That is the door to the sacristy at Tewkesbury Abbey, and that contains a lot of armour, because post-battle the monks went out and picked up all the available loose armour and took it back to reinforce their treasury door. At least one of those strips actually contains a crossbow bolt hole. So the battle detritus was still valuable. You're in a poor part of the world, and the temptation to recover and recycle is not purely a 21st century phenomenon. So lots of problems there. Where does that leave us? The site remains elusive. Archaeology does not confirm any of the existent theories, but it doesn't necessarily, at this point, exclude any of them either. Much further work is needed. Topography to establish exactly what the land usage was and where. More work on what gunpowder weapons were used. Was there an arrow storm, to find out what we're looking for? We need much wider sources on numbers and logistics. Because it was said I would comment on the Yorkist losses, we just don't know. but the survival of all the senior commanders would suggest that if the Lancastrians broke first, there weren't that many. Retargeted archaeology to see if we can find anything. Reevaluate the results. As I said, this takes time and treasure. We needed 5 years to find Bosworth. In the meantime, we need to promote and treasure the common heritage, and the project is doing a lot around that to raise local awareness, because one of the best ways of protecting a battlefield is for the locals to believe that it's theirs and that it matters, so that nobody gets to put a Myra test track on the middle of it, or whatever it may be. We prevent damage to likely sites, and above all, this is absolutely crucial, we make sure that there's no night hawking, nobody turning up with a detector, stealing the result, whatever's there, or doing it just in a cozy deal with a farmer, and flogging it on Facebook, on eBay, because that way we lose the historical record, the archaeological record, and we make it much, much harder. Why does it all matter? Well, let's not forget the good Mortimer that he was, Edward IV, and the defeated commander Owen Tudor are both progenitors of every single monarch of this land from Henry VIII onward, including our own present Queen and indeed young Prince George. I'm running out of time, but I'm about to finish. Let's put it all together by giving you an analogy. If you rely on questionable sources and missing archaeology to come up with a positive theory, you can end up with some very odd ideas indeed. Here is a contemporary record of a finding reported by that well-known chronicle, The Sunday Sport, of a Lancaster bomber found, or was it an American bomber, for superfortress found on the moon, and a later exculpatory story saying that it had vanished for some reason. Put yourselves 200 years forward. What are you going to make of that primary source and explained absence of evidence, unless you interrogate it a little bit further? That's it, folks, to quote Bugs Bunny. If you are interested in more information, I've put there at the bottom where you can find the Battlefields Trust Resource Centre, where we have a lot of material on the battlefield, and a link to the current work of the Mortimer's Cross project, which is continuing to research and to continue to present the battlefield. Thank you very much indeed.